arrogant teacher challenged the student. "You're going to fail." But the final result surprised everyone. Welcome to our channel. Before we start, please like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this. The morning sun gently illuminated the hallways of the institute, while Raoul, a shy but ambitious student, headed to his classroom with a beating heart. I felt a tingling in my stomach every time I thought about the history class taught by Professor Maldonado, a man renowned not only for his vast knowledge, but also for his arrogance. Raoul had spent the last few months hearing rumors about Maldonado's cold and dismissive treatment of his students, and fear becoming the target of his sarcasm. Even so, he had an unwavering faith that his effort and dedication could transcend any obstacle, even the arrogance of that fearsome professor. From the first day of school, Maldonado had made it clear that he could not stand mediocrity, and that only the most exceptional would be successful in his classroom. Raoul, in his discreet way, sat in the back row, hoping not to attract attention, but part of him was curious to find out if those horror stories about the professor were true. The first opportunity he had, Maldonado let out one of his typical taunts when he saw Raoul's notebook, an old and worn notebook that, despite its appearance, contained the boy's meticulous work. The teacher, with a superb smile, said, "With that notebook, you show that you are not prepared for my demands." With each word, Raoul felt a mixture of anger and determination that flared up inside him, but he decided to remain silent and carefully observe the teacher's every gesture. It was as if Maldonado wanted to demonstrate, from the first moment, that he controlled the environment and that anyone who dared to contradict him would be doomed to failure. Raoul, for his part, did not want to confront him directly, but rather to show him that his work and perseverance could speak for themselves. However, every time he raised his hand to answer a question, Maldonado ignored him or looked for another more confident student. This attitude began to create in Raoul a sensation of painful invisibility and a growing desire to improve himself. Despite everything, Raoul refused to give up and tried even harder, reviewing books, researching a library, and trying to find a way to improve the way he took notes. As the weeks passed, the tension grew when the teacher realized that Raoul, far from giving up, continued to arrive on time, participating discreetly and little by little, excelling in the exams. Maldonado then decided to challenge Raoul openly, proclaiming in front of everyone that history was not a matter for fearful or silent people. "You're going to fail," she told him in a harsh voice, while crossing her arms and leaning towards him with a defiant expression. Raoul felt the murmur of his companions rise up around him, but he did not retreat. Instead, he stared into Maldonado's eyes, determined to prove him wrong. That spark of bravery caught the attention of some of his classmates, who began to view Raoul with a mixture of admiration and compassion. Maldonado, on the other hand, was even more arrogant and, convinced of his own power, promised that he would crush Raoul's fantasies. Each class became a scene of tension, with a teacher making scathing comments and a student clinging to his dignity. The tasks were increasingly complex, and Maldonado was in charge of making Raoul see how insufficient, according to him, his contributions were. However, Raoul responded with perseverance and a growing determination that surprised even his closest friends. It was in those moments of public humiliation that Raoul understood that this was not only an academic challenge, but a test of character. Maldonado seemed to amuse others with his comments about Raoul's supposed incapacity, without realizing that he was fueling an internal flame that sooner or later would burst out with force. The pressure did not stop Raoul from moving forward, and the grades began to reflect the care and discipline he put into each job. However, despite the positive results in his exams, the professor insisted on discrediting him, claiming that everything could be simple luck. Raoul understood that to earn Maldonado's approval, he would have overcome a much higher barrier than simply completing tasks. In the midst of it all, the question arose as to what motivated Maldonado to act in such a hostile manner, something Raoul hoped to discover sooner or later. Little by little, the student began to understand that sometimes arrogance and contempt can hide deep insecurities, and that, deep down, perhaps Maldonado was not so different from him. However, this empathy did not prevent Raoul from feeling hurt by the constant attacks, and, on more than one occasion, he doubted his own worth. Even so, every time he found himself on the verge of giving up, He remembered the words that Maldonado had told him. "You're going to fail," and he decided to turn them into fuel for his internal fire. The day the professor announced an extremely demanding final project, Raul knew he would have the opportunity to demonstrate his true potential in front of everyone. He felt a lump in his throat, but also a renewed hope that motivated him to do his best. That hope prompted him to look for allies, fellow students, and mentors who would guide him in the titanic task that lay ahead. Meanwhile, Maldonado, certain of Raul's defeat, used every space in the class to emphasize that only a privileged few could succeed. The atmosphere became even more charged when some students, infected by the teacher's attitude, began to make fun of Raul and doubt his abilities. However, there were also those who sympathized with the boy and gave him their unconditional support. Raul, for the first time, felt that he was not alone and that, with the help of his new allies, perhaps he could reverse the professor's opinion. But Maldonado did not give an inch in his efforts to make him see that he was destined to fail, always emphasizing that brilliance is not learned, but rather inherited. With each hurtful phrase, Raul became stronger because he learned to distinguish between the criticism he brings and the contempt he destroys. This was how the tense and decisive atmosphere was created that, without knowing it, would trigger an outcome capable of shaking the most arrogant teacher and surprising everyone who witnessed the silent struggle of an underestimated student. The challenge was declared, and Raul, with a heart full of doubts, but also courage, prepared to give the final fight. He knew that it would not be easy to face a man who believed himself invincible on his own territory, but he also understood that true strength came from conviction and perseverance. Finally, that determination led him to prepare every detail of the project, without rest, reading until wee hours of the morning and wondering if, really, he would be able to change the perception of such an incredulous professor. The time had come to transform himself and, perhaps, to transform Maldonado with the power of humility and passion for knowledge. The second main point takes us to the classes that followed that first clash, where the tension between Raul and Professor Maldonado became the center of attention in the room. The teacher, far from moderating, doubled the harshness of his comments and made Raul his main target, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere in which the majority of his classmates preferred not to intervene. Those weeks of constant humiliation forged the character of Raul, who, despite feeling hurt, found in silent resistance a way to reaffirm his determination. His shyness, which in other contexts would have been an obstacle, became a shield that protected him from responding impulsively to the teacher's provocations. However, this apparent calm did not prevent the emotional damage he experienced, especially when Maldonado's insults were aimed at questioning his intelligence or labeling him as someone without any talent. The thick air of the classroom was filled with murmurs every time the teacher made a mockery and forced Raul to read his notes aloud, only to interrupt him with sarcastic comments. Even so, Raul remained firm, convinced that, if he could endure that gale, the day would come when he would be able to show who he really was. With each new attack, he strengthened his desire to improve himself, to show the world, and above all himself, that conviction was stronger than hostility. Behind each public humiliation, a seed of courage sprouted in the student, which he watered with silent efforts and long days of study. Many in the room became passive spectators of an act of systematic cruelty, while others, unable to bear the injustice, came to confront Maldonado, although without much success. The professor, in his apparent omnipotence, dismissed any objection, reminding everyone that he was the ultimate authority and that his academic judgment was unquestionable. "Here, only my rules rule," he used to say with a voice that resonated in every corner of the room, instilling a kind of respectful terror. The figure of Raul, fighting in silence, began to arouse sympathy in some of his classmates, especially in a student named Sophia, who saw in his perseverance a reflection of her own personal struggle against insecurity. Sophia approached Raul in the hallways and, with a friendly whisper, told him that if he needed help revising or preparing for exams, she would be willing to help. That gesture of kindness was a balm for Raul's soul, who felt that, in the midst of hostility, there was still humanity and camaraderie. Meanwhile, the professor continued with his discredit campaign, intensifying the criticism and ensuring that Raul had no chance of saving the course. Each word of the teacher was received by the students with a tense silence, as if it were a spectacle that no one wanted to witness, but from which few could look away. Raul, aware of the pressure, avoided looking into the teacher's eyes, trying to concentrate on his notes, but it was not easy to maintain concentration when Maldonado made constant jokes about his supposed mediocrity. Little by little, this trickle of daily humiliations began to break Raul's composure, and on more than one occasion, he left the classroom with red eyes, holding back tears of rage and frustration. However, every time he thought about giving up, he remembered the ultimate goal, the decisive project that would define his grade and his reputation in front of everyone. The teacher, perhaps unconsciously, had become the driving force that drove Raul to give his best, although the verbal violence continued to hurt him deeply. That dichotomy between pain and motivation transformed Raul's nights into an endless study space, as he stayed up until late hours researching and perfecting his ideas for the project. Maldonado's attitude also impacted other aspects of Raul's life, who, due to anxiety and stress, began to neglect his diet and sleep. His worried family sensed that something was not right, but Raul refused to speak openly about what was happening in class, fearing that the situation would get worse if adults intervened. Meanwhile, the professor continued to impose his law, challenging Raul to demonstrate something that, in his eyes, would be impossible, a truly exceptional work that could silence any criticism. The harshness of the classroom extended beyond the doors of the institute, creating a heavy atmosphere that was reflected in the way the classmates related to each other. Some, for fear of becoming the next target, avoided Raul and distanced themselves from him, so as not to provoke Maldonado's wrath. Others, more supportive, began to share notes and advice, although always discreetly, so as not to attract too much attention. In the midst of this tension, Raul's figure grew silently, every day more reflective, firmer in his determination, and surprised to discover an inner strength that he was unaware of. Still, the humiliations in the classroom were still painful, and every time Maldonado confronted him, he could feel the teacher's penetrating gaze judging every aspect of his person. A failure with pretensions of greatness was a phrase that echoed in Raul's mind for days, until he managed to transform it into a stimulus to redouble his efforts. This change in mental chip did not happen overnight, but was a result of constant pressure that, paradoxically, pushed Raul to fight or surrender completely. Slowly, the student began to taste small triumphs in the midterms, receiving grades that surprised even his friends, although the teacher always found something to criticize. But no matter how much Maldonado minimized Raul's achievements, the rest of the class began to perceive that the young man was not as mediocre as the teacher proclaimed, and that, perhaps, there was an undercurrent of injustice in all that. That collective feeling of doubt towards Maldonado's absolute word was a germ that, in the near future, would detonate a monumental surprise in the classroom. Thus, between daily humiliations and internal resurgences, the perfect climate was forged for an unexpected outcome that would test Raul's ability to resist and the supposed dominance of a professor who was too sure of himself. As the delivery date for the final project approached, Raul felt a whirlwind of fear and hope inside him, knowing that it was his last chance to prove himself to Maldonado and the entire class. She began working with Sophia and other colleagues, meeting in the afternoons in the library, researching, sharing ideas, and overcoming her own barriers of shyness to interact with others. Humiliation then became a fuel that fueled his passion to learn and to demonstrate that sometimes enthusiasm can tear down the walls of pride. This second main point thus portrays a period of constant verbal battles, for silences and dignity at stake, where Raul defined himself both by his resistance and by his ability to get up after each attack. No matter how much the professor tried to break him, Raul remained firm in his conviction that the greatest triumph would not only be academic, but also personal. And with that determination, the boy advanced towards a crucial point of the story, without knowing that on the horizon there was a revelation capable of shaking the foundations of everything that Maldonado believed to be unbreakable. The third stage of this story delves into Raul's private life, discovering the multiple challenges he faced outside of school that added to the weight of hostility in the classroom. At home, his family's financial situation was not the best, and Raul had to combine his academic responsibilities with a part-time job at a local grocery store. His parents, proud of his dedication, but worried about the exhaustion that showed on his face, tried to help him as much as possible, although financial limitations did not leave much room for maneuver. Tiredness accumulated after long days, because, in addition to class hours, Roll dedicated the afternoons to his work and the nights to studying, preparing for exams and advancing on the final project. The stress began to take its toll, and every morning he woke up with a knot in his stomach, thinking that he would once again have to face Maldonado's stern gaze and the derogatory comments that accompanied it. Despite this, his determination remained firm. He knew that this was a fiery test that forced him to overcome himself not only to pass, but also to demonstrate that he was stronger than adversity. On several occasions, Roll was on the verge of fainting, feeling that the professor's demands and the circumstances of his life were mixed in a whirlwind that threatened to knock him down. Every time he felt like he couldn't take it anymore, he remembered Maldonado's words echoing in his head, almost like a sentence engraved in fire. "You are going to fail." That bad omen became a personal challenge that invited him to try even harder, to not allow Maldonado's arrogance to define his destiny. But the family situation became even more complicated when his father lost his temporary job, forcing Roll to consider dropping out of school to support his family. It was a decision that haunted his mind for several nights, during which insomnia and doubt took hold of him. However, his mother, with tears in her eyes, persuaded him not to give up his studies, as she saw education as the only way to escape the harsh reality that surrounded them. Moved, Roll promised to keep going, even if it meant doubling his effort and looking for more hours of work in the store. This situation increased the emotional burden on his shoulders, as each day that passed without rest reminded him that he was walking a tightrope. During this time, Sophia became a crucial support. She offered to review together at night, sharing notes and study techniques that made the process a little less distressing. A sincere friendship was born between them, woven through mutual understanding of their respective struggles. Sophia also carried a great responsibility at home, taking care of her younger siblings while her parents worked double shifts. Both found in each other an attentive ear and a heart willing to relieve, even a little, the weight they carried. Even so, Roll could not ignore Maldonado's shadow. The teacher, oblivious to his students' personal battles, continued to exert pressure in the classes, impatient to see how Roll bowed down to the accumulation of responsibilities and the supposed lack of talent. His speech was always the same. He who is born to be mediocre achieves nothing in life. Roll felt that those words were addressed directly to him, and, in a way, it pained him to admit that, in his desperation, he sometimes feared that they were true. This fear was fueled by the setbacks he faced daily, the sleepless nights, and the small mistakes he made in exams when fatigue overcame him. But in the midst of the darkness, a small light of hope kept burning. That light was based on the hope of proving that his teacher was wrong and on the desire to change his family's history through education. Meanwhile, the deadlines for delivery of the final project were shortening, and Roll had to manage to comply with each of the stages proposed by Maldonado. The project required extensive research, hypothesis development, data collection, and finally, a presentation in front of the entire room. The mere idea of standing in front of his class and speaking, knowing that the teacher would watch him with his critical gaze, was enough to give him sleepless nights. But it also encouraged him to improve himself, because he understood that this would be his definitive opportunity to redeem all the humiliations he had suffered. Several colleagues, impressed by Roll's willpower, began to reach out to him and offer to collaborate, sharing sources and materials that would facilitate the investigation. This is how a climate of camaraderie was created among a small group that silently opposed Maldonado's tyranny. They believed that true greatness lay not in humiliation or contempt, but in mutual help and the possibility of growing together. This support network meant a respite for Roll, who for the first time felt that he was not facing such an unequal battle alone. However, there was always a fear that Maldonado would discover these meetings and sabotage them in some way, since it was not unusual for him to show up unexpectedly at the library to check on his students' work. Thus, Roll lived in a constant mixture of relief and paranoia, striving to advance the project while maintaining his part-time job and deal with family tensions. Each day seemed more difficult than the last, and fatigue was beginning to take its toll on him in the form of headaches and a weakness that sometimes prevented him from concentrating. Despite everything, his heart clung to the certainty that, if he managed to endure until the end, he could change not only his own history, but also that of those who believed in him. It was at this point when Raoul began to suffer some anxiety attacks, manifested in tremors and a feeling of suffocation, especially in the mornings before going to class. But instead of giving up, he decided to seek help from the Institute's counselor, who recommended breathing techniques and gave him a space to vent the accumulated pressure. Those moments in the guidance office became a haven where Raoul could be himself, vulnerable but determined, accepting that sometimes courage lies in asking for help. In this way, Raoul's personal obstacles became a source of silent strength, a fuel that mixed with his resentment towards Maldonado's arrogant attitude, and with his desire to demonstrate that no one should be judged for their origin or circumstances. His pride and hope grew at the same pace as the difficulties, generating an internal storm that threatened to overflow at any moment. In the end, this third main point reveals that, beyond the daily humiliations in the classroom, Raoul dealt with a series of problems that made his efforts to get ahead even more admirable. Between economic need, chronic fatigue, academic challenges, and the weight of his own and others' expectations, Raoul walked a dangerous edge. However, his heart remained firm in the promise of not giving up a step in the face of Maldonado's attempts to pigeonhole him as a failure. And so, with his gaze set on the uncertain horizon, Raoul continued to carve out his destiny in silence, waiting for the perfect opportunity to deliver the final blow to his teacher's arrogance. In the fourth phase of this story, it becomes evident that Raoul's efforts and sacrifices begin to have a tangible impact on his academic performance and the perception that others have of him. After countless nights of studying, Raoul's performance in the midterms improved gradually but consistently, increasingly surpassing the class average. This progress, although it did not win him the acceptance of Maldonado, did begin to change the opinions of many colleagues who previously doubted his abilities. Even Sophia, who already trusted him, was surprised to see how quickly Raoul absorbed new knowledge and applied increasingly efficient research methods. Despite this progress, the professor's attitude remained the same: disdain, sarcastic criticism, and a constant reminder that, according to him, Raoul would get nowhere. However, beneath that arrogant facade, Maldonado was beginning to feel some concern as he noticed that the boy, whom he had underestimated, persisted in fighting with unwavering determination. Far from recognizing it, the professor toughened his methods even more, looking for minimal errors in Raoul's work to emphasize his supposed efficiencies. But at the same time, this attitude only managed to stimulate the young man's thirst for improvement, who by this point already considered it a personal challenge to prove his worth in the face of such an obstacle. Thus, Raoul began to prepare the final project months in advance, establishing a rigorous work plan and surrounding himself with colleagues who, out of solidarity or curiosity, wanted to see how far he could go. Raoul's heart was still divided between the fear of failing and the hope of making history in the classroom, defying Maldonado's predictions. Every time the teacher made fun of him, reminding him that some people are born and never excel, Raoul found strength in his concrete progress, in the small victories that pushed him to keep going. Meanwhile, the problems at home did not disappear. His father was still looking for work without much success, which meant that Raoul continued his part-time work to help with basic expenses. However, upon seeing their son's progress and the enormous pressure he was carrying, the family chose to prioritize studying over work hours, adjusting as they could to alleviate the burden. This gesture reinforced Raoul's motivation, who now felt that he could not fail, not only for himself, but also for the sacrifices his family made daily. Every day he woke up with a firm conviction that greatness did not depend on arrogance or lineage, but on will, effort, and perseverance. This change in mentality became evident in the classroom, where Raoul stopped bowing his head in the face of Maldonado's criticism and, little by little, began to respond with solid arguments. The first time he did it, the professor looked surprised for a few seconds, but quickly resumed his condescending tone, downplaying Raoul's intervention. However, the seed of transformation was planted, and several classmates realized that that shy boy was beginning to shine with his own light. His participation in class became more constant, supported by an increasingly solid knowledge and confident handling of the historical data that the teacher demanded. With each new demonstration of mastery of the subject, Raoul felt how self-confidence grew within him, fueled by the nights of hard work and the certainty that he was giving his best. His relationship with Sophia also flourished, based on mutual admiration and complicity that is born when two people share the same goal, the pursuit of excellence despite everything. The teacher, on the other hand, seemed determined to undermine Roll's every success, disqualify his advances with phrases like, "One swallow doesn't make a summer," or "There's still a long way to go before you can be called competent." Even so, he could no longer wrest hope from Roll's heart, who had now understood that each derogatory word was, in reality, an implicit recognition of his progress. It was in this scenario of constant struggle that Roll began to visualize what would be his final project, a profound and critical work on a little-studied historical episode, which would allow him to provide an original approach and demonstrate his capacity for analysis. With the advice of the librarian and a couple of teachers from other subjects who sympathized with him, Roll was gathering primary sources, contrasting versions, and putting together a solid structure for his presentation. Meanwhile, Sophia and some colleagues supported him with parallel research, helped him obtain hard-to-find books, and reviewed the content to make sure there were no writing or coherence errors. This close collaboration consolidated the idea that true greatness is nourished by humility and unity, unlike the vanity and individualism that Maldonado preached. Each step he took in the project seemed to bring Roll closer to the goal, but also increased the expectations of those who knew the rivalry between him and the professor. Soon, the rumor that Roll was working on something impressive spread throughout the institute, even reaching the ears of other teachers. Some were skeptical, believing that, after all, Maldonado was a demanding professional who would hardly be impressed by an ordinary student. Others, however, were intrigued and wanted to witness the final duel between the teacher's arrogance and the student's determination. As the weeks passed, Roll's progress in class became impossible to ignore. Even his classmates noticed that every time there was a test, the teacher's questions became more twisted and complicated, as if Maldonado was obsessed with proving that Roll was not as brilliant as he seemed. But, far from succumbing, the young man responded with courage, drawing strength from the extra motivation that each attack from the teacher meant. "He's becoming obsessed with you," Sophia commented to him on one occasion, to which Roll responded with a tired smile, aware that, in a way, Maldonado's obsession was the best confirmation that he was achieving something significant. The atmosphere in the classroom was polarized. Some students stood on Roll's side, defending his efforts and celebrating his achievements, while others, fearful of contradicting the teacher's authority, kept their distance and replicated his disqualifications. However, the seed of doubt was already planted in many. What if Roll was not the failure that the teacher described? What if, in the end, the student ended up surprising everyone? Behind the scenes, Roll continued to refine every aspect of his project, now motivated not only by the desire to pass, but by the need to vindicate himself and demonstrate to the people who supported him that he was not fighting in vain. He began to rehearse his presentation out loud, training his intonation and posture to prevent his nerves from giving him away at the key moment. Sophia recorded it with her phone during rehearsals, and then they analyzed the videos together, seeking to correct any detail that could take away from the strength of the exhibition. That level of dedication soon transcended the mere pursuit of a grade and became a kind of personal mission, in which each day was one step closer to the climax of the story. With this, Roll understood that what was at stake was not only the subject of history, but the possibility of demonstrating that people can overcome the barriers imposed by pride and prejudice. And so, as the clock ticked inexorably towards the delivery date of the final project, the classroom became a powder keg ready to explode. Maldonado, increasingly uncomfortable with Roll's growing prestige, remained firm in his arrogant stance, convinced that the boy's introduction would be nothing more than an illusory trick that, sooner or later, would collapse under the slightest criticism. But Roll, oblivious to the professor's ego, only thought about improving himself day after day, focused on a goal he had set and the support he received from those who believed in him. This fourth main point seals the transition from a fearful Roll to a determined and transformed Roll, who seeks not only to survive the attacks of an inflexible teacher, but to stand out in such a way that no derogatory comment can minimize his effort. In this way, the foundations are prepared for the climactic moment in which the strength of humility will confront the arrogance of Maldonado in a clash that no one at the Institute will want to miss. The date for the presentation of the final project was quickly approaching, and every fiber of Roll's being vibrated in anticipation of that momentous day. The entire institute seemed attentive to the imminent confrontation between Professor Maldonado and his most challenged student. The hallways were filled with rumors about the supposed magnitude of Raul's project, and more than one wondered if, in truth, he would be able to respond to the brutal questions that Maldonado would undoubtedly launch. The professor, for his part, appeared apparently calm, convinced that that moment would serve to publicly expose the fragility of the students' theories. A few days earlier, Raul asked management for the opportunity to use the multimedia classroom for his presentation in order to show slides, audio recordings, and detailed maps that supported his research. To everyone's surprise, the request was approved, and it didn't take long for word to spread that the presentation would have the most complete format that had ever been seen in the subject of history. This news intensified the excitement among the students, who saw the opportunity to witness something out of the ordinary. The night before the exhibition, Raul could barely sleep. My nerves were on edge, but also a strange feeling of calm knowing that I had done everything possible to prepare the project. He spent the last few hours reviewing his notes, adjusting small details on his slides, and quietly practicing the intonation of each sentence. Sophia was by his side, encouraging him until the last second, reminding him that, no matter what happened, his effort was already a triumph in itself. When the decisive morning finally arrived, Raul felt a mixture of excitement and terror as soon as he opened his eyes. However, he dressed with determination painted on his face, ready to risk everything for everything. When he arrived at the institute, he noticed that many eyes were on him. Some greeted him with gestures of encouragement, others simply watched in disbelief, and a few, allies of Maldonado, seemed eager to witness the moment of Raul's fall. The presentation time was set for the second half of the day, so the first classes passed as a kind of tense preamble, during which Raul could barely concentrate. Finally, the time came. With his heart beating at full speed, Raul entered the multimedia classroom, where a considerable group of students had gathered, including classmates from other grades who had obtained permission to witness the event. In the center of the room, sitting in a chair with his arms crossed, was Maldonado, wearing an expression that oscillated between disdain and curiosity. With a slight tremor in his hands, Raul stood in front of the screen and greeted everyone with a voice firmer than he expected. He began his presentation by outlining the topic he had investigated, a very little-studied historical chapter, full of controversies and documentary gaps that Raul had set out to unravel. As he progressed, he projected slides with dates, written sources, and references from old archives that supported his story. He spoke with passion, but also with rigor, demonstrating the research process he had carried out. His words flowed with confidence, the result of so many nights of practice and conviction that he was presenting something really solid. Little by little, the atmosphere in the room changed. What first seemed like mere curiosity turned into amazement. Some, who expected to see Raul get lost in hesitations, were impressed by the clarity with which he presented his arguments. The carefully designed slides showed a detailed timeline, geographic maps, and testimonies from specialized historians, all coherently linked. Sophia, from her seat, smiled with bright eyes, aware of the enormous progress that Raul was demonstrating. Maldonado, on the other hand, kept his brow furrowed, taking notes in a notebook and occasionally emitting slight exhalations of disapproval. It was clear that he was looking for the slightest mistake to attack, but at least until that moment, Raul was impeccable. After 40 minutes of presentation, Raul closed the theoretical section with a provisional conclusion and announced that he would present a short video with interviews with experts who corroborated his hypothesis. The audience shifted in their seats, eager to see the material. When the video began to play, an academic voice was heard explaining in simple words the significance of the historical episode that Raul was investigating, underlining the originality of the perspective adopted by the young man. It was a coup d'etat that left several speechless, including Maldonado himself, who twisted his mouth in a gesture that was difficult to decipher. At the end of the video, Raul maintained a brief silence and prepared to receive questions, knowing in advance that this was Maldonado's favorite terrain to disqualify the students. Indeed, the professor immediately raised his hand and asked a very specific question, alluding to the authenticity of certain sources used by Raul. The boy, visibly nervous, took a breath and responded with specific references, citing the file where he had obtained the information, as well as the name of the historians who validated his version. There was a murmur of approval in the room, and Maldonado, his expression sour, clicked his tongue. He raised his hand again and asked a second question, this time questioning the analysis methodology that Raul had used to interpret the data. Without hesitation, the student referred to the research theory of a renowned academic, explaining step by step how he had adapted it to his project. For several minutes, a series of questions followed, most of them asked by Maldonado, while other teachers and students also intervened with genuine curiosity. Raul, in each response, maintained his composure, although inside his heart threatened to jump out his chest. The feeling of going through crossfire was mitigated by realizing that every time the professor tried to put him on the ropes, he was able to get ahead with solid arguments. Finally, after a final exchange of questions and retorts, Maldonado remained silent, a long, heavy silence that seemed to envelop the room. Everyone held their breath, anticipating that the professor would issue his verdict or launch some devastating criticism. However, when Maldonado stood up, he did not say a word. He simply looked at Raul with a frown, turned towards the door, and left the room, leaving the audience in a knot of uncertainty. The atmosphere exploded with murmurs, and, after a few seconds, some colleagues approached Raul to congratulate him. Sophia hugged him effusively, celebrating the enormous achievement of having survived the interrogation of the school's most feared teacher. Raul smiled shyly, not completely believing what had just happened. The echo of clapping and expressions of admiration echoed in his ears as he gathered his materials, feeling for the first time in a long time that all his effort was worth it. However, Maldonado's attitude left one question open. Had he become convinced of Raul's worth, or, on the contrary, was he plotting a new attack? Nobody knew for sure, but at that moment, most agreed that the boy had given a masterful lesson and emerged victorious from the decisive test. That partial victory marked the climax of this fifth main point, in which Raul left behind the image of an underrated student to become a contender worthy of respect. Without knowing it, he was on the verge of an even more surprising outcome, since the true outcome would take place when the professor was forced to face the reality that his prejudices could be completely wrong. In this sixth part of the story, the echo of Raul's presentation resonated throughout every corner of the institute. To the surprise of many, the news was not limited only to the student community. Some teachers, intrigued by the rumor that an impossible student had escaped Maldonado's feared criticism, began to request the project material to review. Raul found himself sharing his research with teachers of other subjects, receiving complimentary comments for the depth and originality of his work. This is how the legend of the shy student who had successfully challenged the most demanding teacher began to be carved out. Meanwhile, Maldonado remained silent, making no public comments about the exhibition. This lack of response caused an atmosphere of expectation. Some believed that, after reflecting, the professor would be forced to recognize Raul's merit. Others thought he was just preparing a new coup. However, Maldonado's attitude in classes changed slightly. He no longer made constant mockery and simply looked at Raul with an indecipherable gesture every time he participated. This lack of explicit hostility baffled those accustomed to the professor's usual arrogance. Raul, for his part, was experiencing a mixture of relief and nervousness. On the one hand, he celebrated that the humiliation seemed to have stopped. On the other hand, he feared that that calm was only the prelude to a greater storm. At home, his family congratulated him effusively when they saw his midterm grades, which had risen noticeably. Raul's father, who had finally found a stable job, was excited to feel that opportunities were beginning to smile upon them, at least in regards to the young man's academic future. The joint effort of the family and the help of Sophia and other colleagues had borne surprising results, and Raul finally felt on safer ground. However, the situation was far from resolved. The day arrived when Maldonado would officially deliver the grades of the final project, and everyone eagerly awaited the moment when Raul would find out his final grade. Finally, in the midst of silence full of tension, the teacher named each student and announced their results until he reached Raul. There was an absolute silence, a general holding of breath. Maldonado held Raul's gaze for a moment that seemed eternal, and with a neutral voice he pronounced an unexpected verdict. "You have the highest grade in the course." Those words fell like a bomb. The murmurs multiplied instantly, while Raul, incredulous, felt like his heart was coming out of his chest. Maldonado did not add any explanation or praise. He simply handed out the score sheet and moved on to the next name on the list. But that sentence, short and lapidary, was enough to confirm that Raul had not only passed, but had surpassed all his classmates. Euphoria broke out around him. Sophia hugged him, laughing. Several colleagues came up to congratulate him, and, for the first time, Raul noticed a mixture of respect and admiration in the eyes of many. The satisfaction he felt came not only from the grade, but from the confirmation that all his effort, his sleepless nights, and his internal battles had been worth it. Even so, there was a bittersweet taste, as Maldonado's expression remained impenetrable, as if he did not want to show even the slightest sign of recognition beyond the numbers. With a grade in hand, Raul experienced an emotional breaking point. He remembered the months of humiliation, the temptation to drop out of school, and the hard work to help at home while preparing for this test. He felt like crying with relief, but he held back, aware that Maldonado's gaze was still on him. He then decided to walk to the teacher's desk at the end of class and, with a calm voice, thanked him for the grade he had given, without adding more. Maldonado looked at him in silence, as if an internal struggle was taking place in his head. Finally, he addressed her with a dry phrase, "You have improved." It was the first sign of openness that Raul perceived, a small indication that, perhaps behind the teacher's arrogance, there was something more. That same afternoon, the news spread quickly, and by departure time, Raul was a central topic of conversations in the hallways. Many students stopped him to ask for advice or congratulate him. Others, who had previously doubted him, approached timidly, recognizing their mistake. Even some professors were interested in learning more details about his work, inviting him to share his research in internal forums. It was as if the Institute had changed color overnight, and Raul was now crossing a path illuminated by praise and looks of recognition. When he got home, he shared the news with his family, who welcomed him with hugs and applause full of pride. For them, that victory transcended academics. It represented real hope that the sacrifices made had not been in vain and that a better future was possible. That night, Raul was able to sleep soundly without the oppression of his usual anxiety, feeling for the first time in a long time a peace that he did not remember having experienced. However, in the following days, one issue remained: Maldonado's reaction beyond the ratings. Many wondered if the professor would openly acknowledge Raul's achievement, or if he would insist on maintaining a posture of aloof coldness. Curiosity reached its peak when it was announced that there would be a recognition ceremony for the students with the best performance of the cycle. Among the winners was, of course, Raul, who would receive a diploma as the most outstanding student in the subject of history. That event was a high school tradition, but it had rarely caused so much excitement. The auditorium was filled with students, parents, and teachers, eager to witness the moment when Raul would take the stage and Maldonado, supposedly, would present him with the recognition. Sitting in the front row, with the diploma ready, the professor maintained that same impenetrable expression that had already become famous among everyone. When it was the turn of the history subject, Raul's name was mentioned and the audience burst into applause. The young man stood up, feeling his legs trembling, and walked to the stage with hesitant steps, but firm in his determination to make the most of that moment. Upon reaching the podium, they handed him the microphone for a few words. With a broken voice, Raul thanked his family and colleagues who had supported him, emphasizing the importance of constant work and collaboration. Then he looked at Maldonado, who was still sitting serious, holding the diploma in his hands. There was a tense silence as they both looked at each other, and finally the professor stood up and approached to hand him the document. Raul extended his hand to receive it, hoping that Maldonado would say something to the audience. However, the only thing that came out of the professor's mouth was a dry "congratulations" as he held the diploma by one end, forcing Raul to hold it by the other. When the young man finally had the diploma in his hands, Maldonado turned around to leave the stage, but at that moment, something unexpected happened. For a very brief moment, the professor's gaze seemed to soften, and, with an almost imperceptible gesture, he nodded his head before leaving. It was a small, minimal recognition, but it meant more to Raul than a complete speech of praise. That tacit confirmation that he had managed to remove the professor's unbreakable wall of arrogance illuminated his spirit with a joy that was difficult to describe. The audience, meanwhile, broke into applause when Raoul raised a diploma with a trembling hand, celebrating this triumph that went beyond academics. In that sixth main point, then, everyone's surprise materializes in a success that breaks predictions of failure and demonstrates the power of perseverance in the face of hostility and skepticism. Raoul had not only passed a complicated subject, but had managed to break down, at least in part, the barriers that separated an arrogant teacher from an underrated student. And although Maldonado's recognition was sparse, it did not detract one bit from the feat of Raoul, who stood as a symbol that humility and hard work can ultimately break even the most stubborn wills. After that outstanding triumph, Raoul's life and the atmosphere at the Institute changed significantly. To begin with, the fame of the student who had successfully challenged Professor Maldonado began to spread beyond the school's borders. Some former students, upon learning of the feat, shared the story on social networks, celebrating that someone had finally managed to overcome the iron stance of the institution's most feared professor. These stories, exaggerated in some cases, painted Raoul as an anonymous hero who had fought against academic tyranny and won. Sudden popularity was not something Raoul was entirely comfortable with. Accustomed to anonymity and discretion, he was surprised to see how people who before did not even look at him now greeted him with enthusiasm or asked him for study advice. Although he was proud to have earned the respect of his classmates, he still couldn't get used to the constant attention or the curious glances that followed him through the hallways. Even so, he decided to take advantage of that notoriety to promote a spirit of collaboration. Together with Sophia and other friends, he organized informal study groups and offered help to those who had difficulties in history or other subjects. At the same time, the teaching staff also discussed the situation with interest. Some, who admired Maldonado's demands, began to question whether this extreme rigidity was really necessary to form competent students. Others, however, considered that Raoul's experience confirmed the effectiveness of the teacher's toughness, arguing that the student grew precisely because he had to face a monumental challenge. Be that as it may, an internal debate was generated about pedagogical methods and the importance of balancing demands with emotional support for students. Maldonado, meanwhile, continued to teach his classes with the same rigor as always, but he no longer exhibited the same arrogant attitude when he addressed Raoul. He even allowed himself the occasional fairly neutral comment instead of ridicule or contempt. The tension between the two had dissipated, giving way to a distant but respectful relationship. The professor seemed to have understood, at least in part, that discipline without empathy can close the doors of students' minds and hearts. However, not all the changes were positive. A small group of students, who were envious of Raoul's new prestige, began to murmur that the teacher had been condescending at the last minute. They alleged that, somehow, Raoul had received special treatment to obtain the best grade, ignoring the long hours of work and the humiliations he had suffered. It didn't take long for those malicious comments to reach Raoul's ears, who decided not to pay attention to them. He was clear that, if he had obtained something, it had been based on effort and perseverance, not because of favoritism. Furthermore, he had the support of so many classmates and teachers that he could easily counter any unfounded rumors. Among the professors, the initiative also arose to invite Raoul to participate in a science and humanities fair in the region, where outstanding students presented their work before a specialized jury. When Raoul found out, he experienced a mixture of excitement and nervousness, because this would be an incredible opportunity to show his project outside of the institute environment, but it also represented a new litmus test. With the help of Sophia and the other friends who had collaborated on her research, she set out to update and refine her presentation, adding additional sources and polishing the narrative to make it suitable for a broader audience. This new challenge ignited in Raoul the desire to go even further, to not settle for just one victory. At home, the atmosphere was also different. Raoul's parents were more encouraged, convinced that their son's academic success could open doors for him to access scholarships and opportunities in the future. His mother, especially, kept reminding him how proud she was, repeating over and over that his perseverance had been the key to everything. The father, who was already stabilized in his new job, was optimistic about the possibility that Raoul could continue his higher education without having to sacrifice too much of the family economy. On the other hand, the relationship with Sophia became even closer, not only because of the mutual gratitude they felt, but also because of the affinity and complicity that was born from so many hours of shared study. They found in each other the understanding that was sometimes lacking in their closest environment, and that bond made them feel invincible, capable of supporting each other in the face of any adversity. It was under these circumstances that Roll began to glimpse his future with new eyes. He no longer saw himself as a boy destined for anonymity, but as someone with the potential to contribute something valuable to society. The impact of his transformation after having passed the test imposed by Maldonado was reflected in every decision he made, from his way of organizing his time to the way he interacted with his colleagues. Although he retained the humility that characterized him, he no longer doubted his ability to face academic or personal challenges. However, there was still a pending chapter in history, the true reconciliation with Maldonado. Although the professor had implicitly recognized Roll's worth, there had been no formal apology or open acknowledgement of the hostile attitude he had maintained for months. Some considered that this gesture was unnecessary, arguing that Roll's qualification and award spoke for themselves. Others thought that Maldonado should reflect more deeply and, if possible, publicly rectify his behavior to send a message of self-criticism to the students who had witnessed so many humiliations. For his part, Roll did not hold a grudge, but he felt that, in some way, there was a loose end in that relationship. Aware that he could not force a professor to an act of humility, he decided to let time pass, trusting that future experiences or simple daily contact could foster a more sincere understanding. Meanwhile, the echo of his feat continued to spread, and his name already appeared on the list of recommended students for future speaking and writing contests. With these repercussions and consequences, the story enters a stage in which, after the victory, the effects that Roll's triumph generates in the school system, in the mentality of his classmates, in the teacher's reflections, and, above all, in his own life and that of his family, are explored. Each step taken confirms the importance of perseverance and humility in the face of arrogance and gratuitous cruelty, exemplifying the transformative force that arises when a student decides to face his or her limits and demonstrate that no one is condemned to failure. In this way, the ideal scenario is set for the final lesson, which will synthesize the learnings from this story and reveal the impact that Roll's experience will have on his future and that of those around him. In the last section of this story, the lesson that Roll and his companions, as well as Professor Maldonado himself, learn becomes clearer and deeper. The initial clash between the arrogance of a ruthless teacher and the perseverance of an underestimated student led to a paradigm shift within the classroom and the institute itself. Where fear and coldness once reigned, a space of greater dialogue and understanding began to emerge, thanks to the example that Roll embodied with his silent effort and unwavering determination. As the weeks passed, Maldonado, although he remained a demanding teacher, revealed a slight softness in his treatment of the students. It was not a radical change, since his character was still strictly perfectionist, but there was an attempt to encourage participation beyond destructive criticism. On several occasions, he offered constructive suggestions to some students, something that was unthinkable before Roll's feat. The fact that a student had successfully confronted him in front of everyone seemed to force him to rethink his teaching method. From time to time, comments were heard in the hallway about how Maldonado had asked a student to speak to clarify doubts instead of to make a fool of him. To those who knew the teacher from previous years, this small change was surprising and encouraging, suggesting that, in the end, even the most rigid and haughty personality could give way when faced with a force of dedication and genuine passion for learning. The impact on Roll was equally significant. After his victory, the young man found a confidence in himself that he had never experienced. He no longer trembled when raising his hand in class or doubted his abilities when faced with a new academic challenge. The feeling of inadequacy that had haunted him since the beginning of the course faded, leaving in its place a conviction that, with discipline and perseverance, he could turn any obstacle into a springboard toward improvement. However, Roll did not lose his humility. He continued working with the same intensity and seeking to improve day after day. That combination of security and simplicity made it a positive reference for many, inspiring them to strive without falling into conformity. Sophia, for her part, continued by his side, sharing achievements and overcoming academic and personal difficulties. Both formed a team that promoted group study and solidarity among colleagues. They managed to motivate several of their friends to participate in contests and extracurricular activities, expanding the culture of self-improvement beyond rivalry with a teacher. The history classroom, which used to be a scene of humiliation and fear, was transformed into a more collaborative space, where the students' interventions were received with greater receptivity. Although Maldonado did not openly express his admiration, he did encourage other students to submit projects inspired by Raul's dedication and originality. Little by little, the discourse of imminent failure gave way to the possibility of believing in continuous improvement and second chances. In parallel, the relationship between Raul and Maldonado stabilized in a silent mutual understanding. There was no longer that unbearable tension the first months, and although they did not become friends, because they were still in essence very different people, they respected each other. Raul, on the one hand, recognized that the professor's toughness had been the driving force that pushed him to go further than he ever imagined. Maldonado, on the other hand, had to accept that the true greatness of a student does not lie in his or her previous status, but in his or her ability to learn and strive to the maximum. There was a moment that sealed this lesson for both of them. One morning at the end of class, Raul decided to stay a few minutes to talk to the teacher. With his heart beating, he approached Maldonado and thanked him, not only for the grade, but for the rigor that forced him to grow. Maldonado listened in silence and, with a look that showed something resembling acceptance, responded, "Maybe, if more students had your commitment, it wouldn't have to be so hard." It was a sincere statement, almost a confession that his extreme harshness came from frustration at seeing many students indifferent. With those words, a more human picture was drawn of Maldonado, a teacher who, beyond his arrogance, longed to see his students succeed and considered that toughness was the only way to do so. The farewell between the two was brief but symbolic, a kind of truce that marked the end of the battle. Outside the classroom, Raul's life continued to thrive. The support of his parents and the family's new economic stability allowed him to focus on preparing for the regional science and humanities fair, where his project was received with applause and a special recognition award for the thorough historical research. That experience expanded his horizons, awakening in him an interest in university research and careers related to teaching and history. And so, this story reached its denouement, but not its definitive end, since the learning that everyone had obtained would continue to resonate in each future decision. Raul, the student who believed himself destined for failure after Maldonado's humiliations, demonstrated that the will and passion to improve oneself can cross seemingly insurmountable barriers. Sophia and her companions confirmed that unity and empathy are powerful tools to combat injustice. Professor Maldonado, for his part, learned that respect is not earned through fear, but is nourished by the ability to recognize the potential in each student and accompany them towards their best version. With this, the final lesson is revealed. Arrogance only leads to distance and pain, while perseverance and humility open doors to growth and transformation. It is not about denying the demands or downplaying the importance of discipline. Rather, Raul's story teaches us that when demand is combined with empathy and motivation, even those who seem destined to fail can shine with unexpected strength. And so, in the echo of applause and in the whisper of open books, there remains a certainty that each person is a world of possibilities, a story to be written with inks of effort and hope. The triumph of Raul, who one day felt small under the shadow of an arrogant teacher, stands as a symbol that passion and determination, backed by supportive support, can overthrow any sentence of failure. And that is the most valuable lesson that everyone took away from that school year. Faith in oneself and others, the will to not give in to discouragement, and conviction that sometimes the final results can surprise everyone, including the most incredulous of teachers. If you were inspired by this story, don't forget to leave your comment and share this video so that more people can discover the power of believing in themselves and others. Thank you for joining us, and until next time,